All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves. Mrs. Salma Wolf with immense gratitude for the refuahs from Hashem and the merit of a refuah shlema for all of those in need, and the schus of our brave soldiers and the return of our hostages. Leah Soul as a schus for refuah shlema for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, and for the safety of our soldiers and the safe return of all of the hostages to their families. And Matt Lebowitz in commemoration of the yahrzeit of his mother, Tzipora Bas Meir, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah, the family in Kamma, and the merit Hashem, may our soldiers be safe, secure, and the hostages return to their families, B'Shalom and B'Karov. And of course, we dedicate all of Maseches Daf Yomi, all Maseches Bava Kamma, Le'ilui Nishmas, Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michal Charush Hashem Yikom Damo. May our Talmud Torah provide an aliyah for his neshama and a nechama for his family. But so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Samech Gimel 63, and we are picking up Emir Hashem. And we are picking up on Samech Beis Beis 62b at the Gemara. We started the new parak today. We started the new parak yesterday. Sorry, and we also have to go back. We do have to go back and take a look also at the halachas concerning Tamun Be'esh. We did not finish that piece yesterday. Okay, so maybe what we'll do is we'll start the Gemara, and I think actually it's a little bit of a shorter daf, at least Amud Aleph. So hopefully we'll get back to some of that halacha. So we'll say, remember again, the new Mishnah introduced us to the concept, ultimately again, of the restitution for theft. And what we saw in that particular area is that there are two different models of payment. There's the concept of keren, when you go ahead and you pay back that which you stole, and there's the concept of kefel, paying double the amount that you stole. Wherein lies the difference? The difference depends on the mechanism or the manner in which the item was stolen. There is, if the item was stolen through gezel refers to outright theft, right? Outright theft. Then the halach is you pay back keren. If it's gneva, right? If it's a repetitious theft, secretive theft, then if you are found out, you are discovered, you pay kefel, you pay double the amount. In the world of kefel, if it turns out that you stole livestock, a sheep, or a cow, and you steal the item, you slaughter it and you sell it, then there's another penalty called arba v'chamisha, 4 or 5 times the principal. For a sheep, you would pay 4 times the principal. For a cow, for an ox, you'd pay 5 times the principal. We'll see why that distinction in those amounts. We'll talk about that later. But that was the Mishnah. The Mishnah also pointed out that kefel is different than arba v'chamisha, right? In which sense? In what sense? In that again, kefel applies to all items, whereas arba v'chamisha, the 4 or 5 time penalty payment, only applies to livestock. Okay, says the Gemara. Ve'ila midas tashlumei kefel no heges bein beganav bein between tainis ganav. Umidas tashlumei arba v'chamisha eno no heges ela beganav bilvad lo katani. The Rabbi said, the Gemara points out, by the way, we thought there is another distinction. What's the other distinction? Because we're going to see this later on as well. Kefel, there are 2 different cases of kefel. Classic case of kefel is I go over to Ruvain, I break into Ruvain's house at night, I go ahead and I steal his item, and now again, and then I am discovered afterwards. Again, I don't admit it, I'm discovered afterwards. I pay double, I pay kefel. Okay, well, so we're going to see there's another case. Reuven deposits an item with me. He asks for it back. I say, oh, I'm so sorry, it was stolen. It turns out that halacha l'maisa wasn't stolen. He's holding on to it. I'm also chayiv kefil in that case. But interestingly enough, you would not be chayiv arba v'chamisha in that case, in that second case. That's called towing tainas ganav. In other words, if I were to go ahead and say, Reuven deposited his sheep with me, and then he asked for it back, and I say, you know what, I'm so sorry, I don't have it. And then it turns out, I did have it, I stole it, right? I kept it, I slaughtered it, I sold it. You would not be chayiv arba v'chamisha in that case. You're only chayiv arba v'chamisha when you outright steal an item, as opposed to misappropriate an item that was deposited with you. That's called toin tainas ganav. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, the Mishnah does not mention that distinction between kefil and arba v'chamisha. So Gemara says, Meseilei the Rabbi Chia bar Abba. This seems to support the position of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Why? Dam Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Am Rabbi Yochanan, hatoin tainas ganav bepikadon meshayin tashlumei kefil. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says as follows. We'll say, toin tainas ganav, literally one who makes the claim of theft. That refers again to one with whom an item was deposited. Then when the owner comes back, let's just use names. Reuven gives me an item to hold on to watch for him. He comes and he asks for it back. I say, I'm so sorry, it was stolen. It turns out it was stolen. You know who it was stolen by? By me. By me. That's called towing tainus ganav. I'm making the claim of theft. So then if it turns out that I stole it, I'm chayv to pay kefil. But if you go, and if it turns out that I let's say it was a sheep, and then it turns out that I slaughtered it and sold it, I would be chayv 4 or 5 times. So both say, so this is the position ultimately again of Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba. The fact that the Mishnah does not quote this as a distinction between Kefal and Arba v'Chamisha indicates that the Mishnah actually subscribes to the view of Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba that ultimately, again, whether you steal an item, gneva, or whether you're towing tainus ganav, you misappropriate an item that was deposited with you, halacha l'maisa, you would be chayiv both for kefal as well as for arba v'chamisha. Iked Amri and alternate and others explain. Le'mesel Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba. Say that our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba. Rabbi Yochanan had toain tainas ganav bikadon. If a person goes ahead and was watching an object and then claims that it was stolen from him, so mishalim tashlumi kefal, and it turns out he's discovered that he's a theft, that he's a thief. Ultimately, again, he pays kefal. Tavach umachar. If he had if he slaughtered it and sold it, mishalim tashlume arba v'chamisha. Ultimately, he has to pay 4 or 5 times. To which the Gemara says, "Ki katoni ein bein meruba." I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's lost the place. Good. Gemara says, "Mi katoni ein bein." Does the Gemara says there is no distinction? Meruba katoni. Ultimately, we'll say meruba means that's tashlume kefal, that there are more cases where you have to pay kefal than ultimately again when you have to go ahead and pay arba v'chamisha, ton of a shear. Therefore, the Mishnah did not create an all-inclusive list. Good. So we'll say therefore just two different versions of that previous discussion. Now, we'll say interestingly enough. Interestingly, we're going to see that the way we paskin is as follows. The way we paskin is that there is no distinction between a ganav and toin tainus ganav. So again, this is very interesting. So therefore, for our purposes, whether you surreptitiously steal something or something is deposited with you, and then you claim it was stolen from you, halacha l'maisa, that has the same din. So in both of those cases, right, for just theft, you'll have to pay kefal, and if it turns out that it was livestock and you slaughtered it and sold it, you would pay arba v'chamisha, 4 or 5 times the principal, depending on the nature of the livestock that you misappropriated. So halacha l'maisa, ganav and toin tainas ganav are going to be treated the same. Okay, we'll see that a little bit later conclusively. Shemidas tashlumi kefal nohage. So as I remember again, so the first thing the Mishnah really focused on was the concept that kefal applies to all objects. Right? It doesn't matter what you stole, right? So whether I stole Reuven's watch, or whether I stole Reuven's sheep, or whether I stole Reuven's car, whatever it is, as long as it was a surreptitious theft, right? It was something that I did secretly, so therefore it's gneva. If I am then found, then halacha l'maisa, I have to go ahead and pay kefal. I have to pay kefal. However, again, interestingly enough, so that right, so tashlumi conversely, by the way, right? So that's kefal. Arba v'chamisha, the 4 or 5 times penalty payment, that ultimately only goes on livestock, doesn't apply to anything else. The Gemara says, from where do you know this? From where do you know this? I was about to say, there's 2 questions over here. Really what we're dealing with primarily is, how do I know that kefal applies to everything? Applies to everything. So here we go. The Tanur Rabbanon, we're going to see now, it's a klalu pratu klal. Really, really quite interesting. So the Gemara says, the Tanur Rabbanon, I'll call davar pesha for any. So we'll say, so just let me quote the pasuk in its entirety. It says, I'll call davar pesha for any matter of sin. Al shar, al chamar, al seh, al salma, al kol aveda asher yomar kihu zeh ata elokim yavod dvar shneim. So it's actually talking about over here that halacha l'maisa, for any matter of iniquity, on an ox, on a donkey, on a sheep, on a garment, on a lost object, that you will say kihuzeh will define all of these phrases. Ultimately, before the judges, this matter will come. Asher yashirun Elohim yashalim shtaim l're'ehu. He who the judge finds guilty will ultimately pay double kefil to his fellow. So here we go. I'll call davar pesha for any matter of sin, klal. That's a general statement. Al shor, al chamor, al seh, al salma, for an ox, for a donkey, for a sheep, for a garment. Prat, that's a specific statement. Al kol aveda, for any lost object. Chazar v'kalol, that is a general statement again. So we'll say, what do you have? Klalu pratu klal. Now remember, how do you darshna klalu pratu klal? I'atadon elekein haprat. In general, when you have a klal uprat uklal, so ultimately again the klal is defined or is modified through the prat. What's unique about the prat? Mahaprat mefurash davar hamataltal v'gufa mamon. So we'll say the prat in all of these cases is something that is movable, it's mobile, and gufa mamon means it has an inherent value. Right, that's the common denominator. It's movable and it has an inherent value. Af kol davar hamataltal v'gufa mamon. So therefore, I will say what the pasuk is doing, what the klalu prat does is, what type of object is subject to the kefel obligation? So essentially, the criteria for being subject to kefel is davar hamataltal. You could move it, the gufa mamon, and it has an inherent value. Okay, so what does that come to exclude? Yatsu karkaos shemetaltalin. So I will say it turns out that it excludes karka. So if you quote unquote steal karka, and I will say the whole notion of stealing karka in general in halacha is an interesting discussion. In general, we have a principle that karka ain't an exelis. You can't steal land. Can't steal land. Again, so but we'll talk about that. In any event, this comes to exclude land. So let's say for argument's sake, you stole land, right? You would not be subject to kefil for stealing land. Yatsu avadim shikshul karkos. If you stole avadim, right, it excludes avadim, right? Because an eved is compared to land. Yatsu shtaros, it excludes documents. Sha'afapi shemataltalin, even though a document ultimately, again, obviously is mobile, is movable, ein gufan mamon. A document itself does not have an intrinsic or inherent value. Yatsu hagdish. Furthermore, again, hekdish is also excluded. Re'ehu ksiv, because the pasuk phrases this as an act, as a crime, right? A sin committed against your fellow. And remember, again, hekdish is not considered to be your fellow. So this is incredible and incredibly profound. So therefore, the whole notion of what is subject to kefel, what is not. So remember again, kefel, double payment, let's just get our facts down. Double payment applies where? Geneva, right? Only surreptitious, secretive theft. Now what the pasuk is doing is telling me, so what types of theft are subject to kefel? So now based on the klal uprat uklal in the pasuk, the only time you're subject to kefel is if you steal an item A that is mobile and B has an inherent value. So really, what is that coming to exclude? It's coming to exclude karka, coming to exclude avadim, right? Because again, karka is not mobile. Eved is compared to karka, coming to exclude shtaros, because a shtar is generally considered to not have an inherent value. Beautiful. And also excludes hekdish, because again the pasuk is lashon of re'ehu. Beautiful. So why don't we say imaha prat mefurash davar shenevelasa metame b'mago ubemasa? Now both say the truth is, if you take a look at the items included in the pasuk, what does the pasuk have here? The pasuk has shar chamar seh. Shar chamar seh. What's the common denominator between shar, chamar, and seh? These are all items that if they die without shchita, right, there's an avela. Ultimately, again, their carcass conveys tuma b'maga ubemasa. Remember, again, maga means touching it, masa means carrying it. So maybe that's the common denominator. You're chayiv for kefil for any item that conveys tuma b'maga ubemasa. Af kol davar shemin also b'tame maga masa. What does this come to exclude? Aval ofos lo. but not birds. We spoke about this before. Birds, right? Do birds convey tumah? So it depends. It depends. Kosher bird conveys tumah, but only when? The beis habliya, when you swallow it. When you swallow it. Non-kosher birds do not convey tumah at all. So maybe he's coming to exclude birds, that if you steal a bird, it's not subject to kefel. The Gemara says, Umi matzis amritachi, but how can you create that? How can you create that paradigm? After all, v'hasalma ksiv. I will say the pasuk doesn't just speak about kefel in the context of livestock. It also speaks about salma. What's a salma? A garment. A garment. So how can you create that paradigm? To which the Gemara says, you're right, Amri, anan bebali chayim kamrinam. No, you're right. Salma tells me that kefel also applies to inanimate objects. But what I'm talking about over here is maybe kefel only applies to livestock, to animals that fit in the criteria ultimately of shar chamar seh. And what's unique about shar chamar seh? That these are items that when they die without shchita convey tumah, tamaga, and masa. Therefore, the only types of livestock for which you are chayiv for kefel are items that convey tumah, b'maga, and masa, coming to exclude birds. Ultimately, I got it. Salma teaches me that kefel applies also to inanimate objects. When it comes to kefel vis-a-vis Bali Chaim, animals, it only applies to animals which convey tumah through tamaga masa, top of Samech Gimel, because we'll say the ha kol chad v'chad klal uprat ba'ape nafshe darshinale. In other words, we'll say the way I could look at the pasuk is essentially, it's actually very interesting to look at the pasuk. The pasuk is being darshaned through a klal uprat uklal. But maybe all of the items mentioned in the pasuk, in other words, the pratim, kind of all have their own klal upratu klal. In other words, there's a klal upratu klal for shar, chamar, and seh, and there's a klal and pratu klal for salma. Therefore, it's an interesting way to darshan the pasuk. So therefore, again, maybe the klal upratu klal for shar, chamar, and seh teaches me that what? Teaches me that the only type of livestock that is subject to a kefal obligation is the type of livestock that would convey tumah b'maga u'b'masa. But if you have livestock that would not convey tumah b'maga u'b'masa, it's not subject to kefal. What's the livestock that doesn't convey tumah through maga and masa? Birds. That's a Samech Gimel base. Samech Gimel of 63a, second line down. Aval ophos lo. But birds should be excluded ultimately again from the din of kefel. Okay, imkein nichtov rachmana chad prata. If that's the case, let the Torah just write one prat. In other words, so why do you have to have all of these specific examples of objects in the pasuk? To which the Gemara says, here's the problem. Hey nichtov, which prat, which specific item should we write in the pasuk of kefel? Ikas of rachmana shar. If the Torah would have just said shar and ox, havamina karav legabi mizbeach in, shein karav legabi mizbeach lo. I will say this is interesting. Had the Torah just written shar, I will say now it's interesting when you do look at a pasuk like this. It is interesting because the Torah is going out of its way to write all of these items, right? So al kol davar pesha, for any matter of sinful behavior by theft, whether it's talking about a shar, a chamar, a seh, or a garment, it's strange. It's strange. In other words, why don't you just say for any object? For any object, right? Or give me one example, and I'll learn all the other examples from one. Whenever you start with multiple examples like this, it is intriguing. So the one says, I'll tell you, here's the problem. If you were to just write one, which one would you write? So let's say, for example, we would choose shar. Okay, Torah would tell me that there's a din of kefal by shar. Here's the problem. What's unique about shar? Shar is an animal that is offered up on the mizbeach, offered up for sacrificial purposes. So I would have thought, ikaz of rachmana shar, havamina karav legabi mizbeach in, shein karav legabi mizbeach lo. I would have thought, since the Torah writes shar, therefore it's only an animal that has the ability to be offered up on the mizbeach that is subject to kefil. But if an animal can't be offered up on the mizbeach, it's not subject to kefil. Okay, because of rachmana chamar, and the Torah would have just said chamar, hava mina kadosh bebechora in, shein kadosh bebechora lo. Both say, what's unique about chamar? Chamar ultimately, again, remember, chamar is the only non-kosher animal that has kedushas bechor. firstborn sanctity. So I would have said, what kind of animal ultimately again is subject to kefil? An animal that has kidushas bechar, but an animal that doesn't have kidushas bechar maybe should not be subject to kefil. So therefore, again, fine. So imke nichtov rachmana shar v'chamar. Fine. So I understand about saying you need shar and chamar, right? Because remember again, they both kind of offset each other, right? So whereas shar is an animal that is offered up on the mizbeach, chamar is not. So therefore, it tells you that kefil applies to all animals, whether they're offered up on the mizbeach or not. On the other hand, chamar has firstborn sanctity, but shar does not. So therefore that tells you whether an animal is offered up on the mizbeach or not, or the animal has kedushas bechar or not, everything is subject to kefil. Beautiful. Now, I'll say leaves me with one more question, which is, why do I need seh? Why do I need seh? To which the Gemara says, Shmamina la'asuye ofos. So Rabbi said, this is interesting. The Gemara says, maybe the inclusion of seh essentially comes to go ahead and include the rest of the animal kingdom, including birds. Including birds. Because I remember again, like we said before, the problem is if it would have just said shar and chamar, right? As much as those two animals are great to tell me that all animals, whether they have firstborn sanctity or offered up in the mizbeach, it doesn't matter. They're included in the din of kefil. The problem is they do have a very strong common denominator, which is that halacha l'maisa, they are subject to tumah b'mago b'masa, which would seem to exclude birds. So therefore the extra inclusion of seh, we don't need seh. Right? Seh doesn't really bring anything new to the table, except maybe what it does do is it comes to include the rest of the animal kingdom. The rest of the animal kingdom, and therefore halacha l'maisa, that comes to include everything else, including birds. Okay. I ve'ema la'asuye ofos torim dumya dised dimitame begadam beisavliya. So we'll say, so maybe not, maybe it only comes to include birds that are tahar. Birds that are tahar, right? That ultimately, again, dumya deseh, similar to seh, demitame begadim abeis aval ofos tmeim, delespu tuma, delomatime begadim abeis abliya lo. I will say, but maybe seh only comes to include kosher birds, because kosher birds at least have the ability to convey tuma in some way, right? Like we said before, if you take a kosher bird. Remember, we're talking about a kosher bird that did not have shechita, right? So if a kosher bird that did not have shechita and you swallow it, ultimately it conveys tumah while swallowing it. But a non-kosher, so in that respect, at least the kosher bird is like other animals, which has the ability to convey tumah, as opposed to a non-kosher bird which doesn't convey tumah at all. To which the Gemara says, "Lo kol ribuyahu." They both say the word kol is a ribuy. Al kol aveda, right? Kol comes to include everything, even ophos. Okay, so therefore I will say, so it turns out, so what's interesting to note over here is, it almost sounds like the way the pasuk is kind of set up is like this. So you need shar and chamar, because again, had it just said one of those, one would have thought that in order to be subject to kefil, you have to have the unique qualities of the particular stated animal. So if it would have just said shar, you would have thought it has to be an animal that's offered up on the mizbeach. If it would have said chamar, you would have thought that it's an animal that has kidushas bechar. So therefore you have both of those. Seh, it sounds like over here what's happening over here is seh comes to include birds, but even seh doesn't really include all birds. Maybe it only includes kosher birds. So therefore the word kol essentially comes to include everything else. Everything else. And that tells me pretty much everything is subject to kefil, or at least everything in the animal kingdom is subject to kefil. To which the Gemara asks a technical question. So 1 second. Kol ribuyo. So the Gemara says, "V'chol heicha dekasiv kol ribuyohu." Is that true? Is kol a ribui? Is that the way it works? That it will say every single time you see the word kol, that kol is an inclusive word that comes to include everything. Let's see, of course you understand, everything is always a relative term, but it comes to include everything. Is that the halacha? Watch this. We actually had this Gemara not so long ago. V'ha gabi meiser. We will say, but yet by meiser sheni, dichsiv kol. Right? They will say, the pasuk about meiser sheni says kol. The kadarshina bechlal uprat. I will say ultimately again, and we darshan it with a klal uprat. What's the pasuk we're referring to? The sanya. We'll say is incredible. We actually had this not so long ago. V'nasata v'kasef b'chol asher ta'ave nafshecha. So we'll say, remember again, the pasuk is talking about over here as follows. Context. Meiser sheni, right, is the tithe that I as a farmer have to go out and separate during certain years of the 7-year or really 6-year tithing cycle. What's the halacha of Meiser sheni? It's mine, I get to eat it, with one qualification, which is, has it in Yerushalayim. Let's say, Baruch Hashem, you have, quote unquote, too much bounty. Can never have too much bounty. We have too much bounty in earth, too much to carry to Yerushalayim. So Allah Lamaisa, what can you do? You can redeem it on money. Transfer Meister Sheni sanctity onto the money, bring the money to Yerushalayim, and use that money to purchase produce in Yerushalayim. Now, the pasuk is talking about over here, what can you use the money for in Yerushalayim? So the pasuk says, V'nasanta hakasef, B'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha. Right? You could use the money for whatever your heart desires. Now, but I will say, then the pasuk goes on. Ba'bakar, batzon, ba'yayin, u'ba'shechar. For cattle, for sheep, for wine, for intoxicating beverage, for beer. U'b'chol asher tish'alcha nafshecha, whatever your heart desires. Is reading the pasuk. V'yachalta Hashem l'fnei Hashem elokecha. You will eat there in Yerushalayim before Hashem your God. V'samachta ata u'veisecha, and you will rejoice, you and your home. You and your home. So Rabbi say, so again, this is the pasuk of Meister Sheni. So here we go. So now Rabbi say, v'nasata kesef v'chol ta'ave nafshecha. So you will go ahead. Sorry, nafshecha. You will go ahead and use the money for whatever your heart desires. That's a klal. Right? General statement. Which was, again, when you look at that, you will say, what can you use Meister Sheni money for? What can you use it for? Whatever your heart desires. Now, whatever your heart desires is a klal. That means whatever you want. That's a klal. Babakar ubatson bayayin ubashechar. Then I'll say again, we have cattle, sheep, wine, beer, prat. That, right? That's a specific. Now we're defining, right? We're limiting. We're giving specific items which you can use Meiser Sheni for. B'chol asher tish'alcha nafshecha, whatever your heart desires. Once again, chazar v'klal. So we'll say, what do you have over here? We'll say, by the way, you have to say, the beauty of this pasuk of Meiser Sheni, this is probably one of the clearest illustrations of a klal uprat uklal, right? These open-ended statements, use the money for whatever you want. Then again, prat specific, bakar tzon, yayin, sheichar, and then again another general statement, whatever you want. So klal uprat uklal. So we'll say, what do you do with this? What do I do with a klal uprat uklal? Iyat hadan ela ke'ina prat. Now we'll say, the way it works in the klal uprat uklal is the prat defines the scope of the klal. The prat defines the scope of the klal. So how does that work over here? Both says, what's unique about the prat in all of these cases? Maha prat mafurash, pri vigidule karka. So both say, what's unique about the prat? What's unique? What's unique about the prat ultimately, again, as well say the prat in all of these cases, the prat of bakar, son, yayin, and sheichar is pri. It isn't something that comes from something else. Ugidule karka, and ultimately again it grows from the ground. So just to plug that back in, bakar tzon, right? Let's look at this. Bakar tzon, pri, they're born of a mother, right? They come from something. Gidule karka, they grow from the ground. They're considered as if they grow from the ground. Why? Because they're nourished, they graze, right? So because they're grazing animals, they're considered as if they grow from the ground. Obviously, again, yayin sheichar, ultimately again are made from dates, made from grapes, which grow from the ground. So that's the prat. So av kol pri gidule karka. Said Rabbi say, what can you use your Meiser Sheni money for? Anything that's pri, something that comes from something else and grows from the ground. So the Gemara says, Amri bakol klala. So Rabbi say, so now here's what's interesting. We were just saying before, Rabbi say, that kol is a ribui. Right? Kol is a riboy. We just said that before. In the pasuk, ultimately, again, by Kefel, that the pasuk said, by Kefel, al kol aveda. And we just said kol is a riboy, and the riboy includes everything. Here, I will say we're using kol as a klal, not as a riboy. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Amri, bikol klala, kol ribuyahu. It's interesting if I will say it's two words. The Gemara says, Bichol is a klal, Kol is a riboy. So by Meiser Sheni, I have the word Bichol. So Bichol ultimately again is a riboy. But again, by Kefel, I have Kol, which we're using as a riboy. Okay. The other possibility is Kol Klalahu. In general, kol is a klal. Mihu kol dahacha ribuyahu. But it could be in general that kol is a klal, but the kol over here by kefel is being used as a ribuy. Okay, but it could also be the simple answer could also be that simply one word could be used in different exegetical ways depending on the context of the pasuk. In any event, michti ksiv meikara klal uprat uklal dichsiv kiyitin ish areehu. So we'll say. So now watch this. The Gemara goes like this. So now, fine. We had that little Meiser Sheni break. Now back to Kefel. So here we go. Michti. Let's analyze this. Ksiv meikara klal uprat uklal. I will say, by Kefel, the way the pasuk was structured was a klal uprat uklal. How so? Here we go. Dichsiv ki yitin ish areehu kesef o kelim. The pasuk says, ultimately again, if you give to your fellow kesef or kelim, right? I should say differently. Ki yitin ish areehu. When you give to your fellow. So in other words, I gave something to my friend. I gave something to my friend. Ultimately again to watch. So I'll say, what is that? What am I giving him? Right, klal, that's anything. Kesef o kelim, then it says I give him ultimately money or utensils, prat. So ultimately that's a specific statement. Lishmar, to go ahead and guard. Hadar v'kalal. Ultimately, again, that went ahead and that's another general statement as well. So you have a klal, uprat, uklal in the pasuk of Kefel. Hi, I'll call davar pesha nami lichlal upratu da'asa. Now here's what's interesting. There are two different psukim over here, right? So the pasuk that we were quoting before was I'll call davar pesha, where we also had a ribui of ultimately again of a klal upratu klal. I shouldn't say ribui, a klal upratu klal. And over here in the second pasuk, you have a klal upratu klal. So we'll say. So it sounds like there are two different psukim that the Gemara is darshaning by Kefel. So now what we're going to try to understand is why do I need two psukim? So watch this. So the Gemara says, hi, I'll call davar pesha. So we'll say that I'll call davar pesha, which we were talking about before. Nami lechlal upratu da'asa, nichtov rachmana lahane prate gabihech klal upratu klal. I'll call davar pesha lamali. So what the Gemara is asking over here essentially is, why do you need two klal, prat, and klals? We're dashing two psukim, which seems to indicate about everything that's included in the obligation of Kefel. And Gemara is asking a very simple question. Why do I need two separate psukim? Shmamina ribuyuhu. So we'll say ultimately again it must be because one of them is not being darshan as a klal upratu klal, rather one of them is being darshaned as a ribui. Otherwise, the Gemara will say it would be repetitive. To which the Gemara says, "Hashta da amrit kol ribuya." So we'll say, so now that I know that the word kol is a ribui, right? And kol comes to include everything. Kol comes to include everything. If that's the case, the Gemara says, kol hani prati lamali. So then we'll say, so now we're back to square one, right? So we'll say we're going back to the original policy that we spoke about before. When we said al kol aveda, kol comes to include everything. Kol is a ribui, and kol essentially teaches me that what? Everything is subject to Kefel. Okay, if everything is subject to Kefel, Rabosai, I go back to my original question, which is, why does the pasuk need to list Shar, Chamar, Seh, and Salma? Right, we're right back to where we were. In other words, if Kol includes everything, why they need to be item specific? So here we go. To which the Gemara says, no. We know the answer to that. The answer to that is Chal mi'ute karka. Avadim, Then Rabbi say, remember again, I need the specifics. Why do I need the specifics? Because Rabbi say, remember again, what did we say before? Based on Shar, Chamar, Seh, what does that teach me? And Salma, what does that teach me? That teaches me ultimately again that in order to be subject to Kefel, you have to be an item that is mobile and has an inherent value. That comes to exclude what? Karka, which is not mobile, Avadim, which is compared to karka, right? And shtaros. Why shtaros? Ultimately doesn't have an inherent value. Salma, lemi'ute davar she'ena mesuyam. So we'll say this is interesting. Salma, this is very fascinating. Salma, we'll say, what's unique about a garment? A garment has a siman, right? Now we'll say, remember again, you have to appreciate something. We think about clothing as being mass-produced. Right, so mass-produced clothing, right? You and I, we go to the store, we buy the same shirt. Your shirt is like my shirt. Remember, when clothing is individually produced, it's custom clothing, right? Everything has some unique aspect to it. So what Salma says about say is the only way to make a claim of theft and ultimately be entitled to kefel, Salma teaches me, the object that is stolen must be something that is identifiable by the owner. But for argument's sake, if you have a mass-produced item, then halacha l'maaseh, if there's no siman, you can't really claim kefel. Interesting idea. That's what Salma lemi'ute davar she'ena masuyam. Look at Rashi, last Rashi on the page. Lemi'ute davar she'ena masuyam she'en lebaylim siman bo shepatim kefel. If you have an item that does not have a siman, then ultimately, again, halacha l'maaseh, you can't make a claim of kefel, which makes sense, because if it doesn't have a siman, then what Rabbi say? There's no way really for you to make a legitimate claim that the object that is lost belongs to you. Okay, interesting idea. Al kol aveda. What about the phrase al kol aveda? So I just want to point out what's happening over here, right? So now remember again, this has just been a beautiful journey, just to dash the klal upratu klal, but really to highlight one central point, which is what? The kol in the pasuk I will say. Al kol davar pesha, right? Al kol, the kol, which is actually mentioned twice in the pasuk. Al kol aveda. The kol is a ribui. And what kol does in this pasuk is says that kefel applies to everything. But if kefel applies to everything, why do you need specific examples listed in the pasuk? To which the Gemara says, because the truth is, kefel applies to everything, but it doesn't apply to everything. In other words, it applies to everything. It applies to everything that exists within a certain group, right? Within certain parameters. The examples in the pasuk define the parameters. So, for example, shar, chamar, seh define parameters. What are the parameters? Ultimately, again, an item ultimately that is mobile, right, and has inherent value. That excludes karka, avadim, shtaros. Kefel doesn't apply. Salma says that ultimately, again, only an item that has a siman, right? Only an item that has a definable trait, a definable quality, siman. Mark or sign, good, right? So it has to have a siman. So they both say, what Kol says is now that we're defining our parameters, so now, again, I will say essentially, if it's an item that is mobile, has an inherent value, and has a siman, anything, Kol says, anything and everything that fits into that category ultimately is going to be subject to kefel. Fascinating. To which the Gemara says, Al kol aveda. They say, but still I have another phrase, Al kol aveda, any object that's lost. What does that come to include? So we'll say that comes to include B'cheber Abba. What does the B'cheber Abba hold? B'cheber Abba Rabbi Yochanan, Hatoin Tainas Ganov. So we'll say on the base, Ba'aveda, B'shai D'Shomei Kefa. So both says, remember again, now we're really back to square one. This goes back to what we started a little. This is literally the first Gemara in the Gemara. So both says, remember again, there are two ways that you could be a Ganov, right? Let's talk about this. It's good to know. Two ways in which you could become a Ganov, right? Way number one, Abosai, right? Old school Ganov. Old school Ganav, right? You're not looking, I steal your wallet, right? Or I break into your car at night, break into your house at night, right? Old school Ganav. There's another form of Geneva, which is, Ruvain deposits an object with me, comes back to claim it. I say, I don't have it. It was stolen. Now again, I will say it's very important. I'm making the claim it was stolen. So now halacha l'maaseh, it turns out it was stolen. Who was it stolen by? Me. That's called toin tainas ganav. That's called making the claim of theft. On the Kasumik, Shabbos says, now watch this. Now the Gemara is asking, what does the phrase al kol aveda come to do? So the Gemara suggests al kol aveda comes to teach me that if halacha l'maaseh you are toin tainas ganav, you're the custodian, and now when the owner comes to reclaim the object, you claim that it was stolen from you. But it turns out that you're the actual thief. That even in that case, you have to pay kefal as well. Shene'emar al kol aveda asher yomar. Beautiful. So if I will say that this is really incredible. That rounds out the whole pasuk. So therefore I will say what we have over here by the pasuk by kefal is like this. Kol comes to teach me that kefal applies to everything. But now the Gemara says, okay, what's everything? Let's define the parameters of everything. So shar, chamar, seh teaches me the object has to be mobile and have an inherent value. Salma comes to teach that the item has to have a siman. Al kol aveda teaches me that the din of kefal doesn't just apply to a straight out thief, to a straight out ganav, but also applies to toin Tainos Ganav. Incredible. They both say that's the pasuk. Beautiful. Both say Samach Yom 63b, second line down. Tanan Hassam, we learned there. Heichan Pikdoni. We'll say, here we go. Great case here. Great case. Right? Ruvain deposited his object with me. I don't want to be the Rasha. For today, it's early. I don't want to be the Rasha. Right? I deposited my object with Ruvain. Let Ruvain be the Rasha. I had to both say every day, ultimately, again, there's a new opportunity, right? What was yesterday is done. Maybe yesterday I was a Rasha. But just because I was a Rasha yesterday does not mean that I have to be a Rasha today. Every day, Sasamis brings down that when every day that begins, a person is like a katan shenolad. I'm like literally, again, a child who has been reborn. We often look at time as a continuum, right? So that yesterday is an extension, today is an extension of yesterday. Sasamis brings down that's not how time works. Each and every day is looked at as a unit, as a lifetime in and of itself. So yesterday was terrible. Okay, there's an opportunity to course correct today. And I don't come into today saddled with the baggage ultimately. The Ar Chaim HaKadosh brings down in Dvarim an incredible yesod. Ar Chaim says that the neshama is made up of multiple individual parts. And every day when you go to sleep, there's a piece of your neshama that ascends heavenward. And after 120, when you go up to Shamayim, all of those parts of your neshama assemble together to become one cohesive unit. So there's a beautiful part and there's a scary part in that. The scary part in it is that if yesterday was really bad, that means that part of my neshama has already ascended heavenward, and it's kind of there. It's kind of there, a little bit like locked in. The beautiful part about that is that today, I begin with a brand new chelik of my neshama. There's a brand new piece. Untainted, pure, righteous, beautiful, magnificent. And so whatever the mistakes of yesterday were, they do not follow me into today. Okay, so therefore Ruvain is going to be the Rasha, not me in this case. So now watch this. I deposit the object with Ruvain. Now what happens? I go over to Ruvain. So I give Ruvain my watch, right? Say, Ruvain, do me a favor. I want you to look at, guard my watch. I come with Ruvain and say, Heichan Pikdoni. So where's my pikadon? Where's my watch? Amar le Avad. Ruvain says, I'm so sorry. Lost it. Avad, it got lost. I should say, ultimately it was lost. So mashpi achani. So I go to Ruvain and say, Ruvain, okay, so take a shvua that it was lost. Va'amar amen, and ultimately Ruvain takes the shvua. Va'idin also sha'achlo. Now we'll say, after Ruvain takes the shvua, witnesses show up, and they say, no, Ruvain didn't lose it. Literally, achlo means he consumed it. In other words, he sold it. Right, or he has it. Right, what's talacha? Mishalim esakeren. Ultimately, we'll say he has to pay back. So again, he lied. He has the object. He has to pay back the keren, the principal. Hoda al pi atzmo. What happens if he admitted it? Right. In other words, he swore falsely, and then he admitted that he swore falsely. Then what's talacha? Mishalim keren v'chomesh v'asham. Then Abba say again, he pays principal, chomesh, the additional fifth. This and an asham, a carbon. That's the penalty for swearing falsely. Okay. Now Abba say. Now I want to point out over here. You're asking why didn't he pay kefel? Now remember, why not? He didn't make a claim of theft. What was the claim he made? It was lost. So therefore, when you make a claim that it was lost, and it turns out that you're a liar, you have to pay keren. If it turns out that you're a liar, and you also took a false shavua, you pay keren, right? Principal, chomesh, additional fifth, and asham, the carbon. Next, heichan pikdone. Go over to Ruvain. Ruvain, where's my watch? Where's my item? Amar lo, I'm so sorry. Nignav, it was stolen. I say, okay, mashpi achani. Listen, Ruvain, it's not that I don't trust you, but I don't trust you. So therefore, again, you're going to take a shvua. I'm going to ask you to swear. And what happens? Va'amra amen. And he swears. Va'idin me'idin also shenignav. Now we'll say after he swore, witnesses show up and they say, Ruvain, you stole it. You stole it. We know that you have it. So we'll say first white line, Mishayim Tashlume Kefel. Here we go. So we'll say he pays Kefel. Then we'll say, why does he pay Kefel? Why does he pay Kefel? Because Halacha L'maisa, this is Toin Tainas Ganav. Right? So now again, Ruvain, the Shomer, is claiming that the item was stolen. So he's making a claim of theft. It turns out that he stole it himself. Therefore, he's Chayiv Kefel. Hold the Me'atzmo. We'll say, what happens if after having taken the Shavua, he admits on his own that Allah L'maisa he lied. V'shayim Keren v'chomesh v'asham. Then ultimately, and I will say, then he goes in and he pays principal, the fifth, and the carbon. I will say now why is that? Remember, Kefel is a knas. Kefel is a penalty. What's the halacha by mode b'knas? If you admit that you owe the penalty, pater, then ultimately you're exempt. So in this case over here, where he admits that he stole it, again, he's admitting a little. Again, unfortunately, he took the shavua already. So halacha l'maisa, he's going to have to go ahead and pay Karen, but right, and chomesh and asham for the false shavua. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Katani miha betoin tainas ganav d'mashayim tashlomei kefal. So we'll say, what you see over here is something very interesting. That halacha l'maisa, if you are a shomer watching an object and you make a false claim that the object was stolen, but in fact it was not stolen, that halacha l'maisa, and it turns out that you're lying, that ultimately you pay kefal. That you gave up. That's the case of Toin Tainas Ganav. Aval, Toin Tainas Avad, Lo Mushalim Tashlumei Kefel. But I will say what is clear is that if you make a false claim that the item was lost, and it turns out the item was not lost, you don't pay Kefel. Okay, I will say that's exactly what it says, right? So remember again, if Ruvain claims the object was lost, but it turns out that he stole it, he doesn't go ahead and pay Kefel. It's only if he claims that it was stolen. So the Gemara says, "Va'afilu toin tainas ganav b'shvuahu d'mashayim tashlumei kefal." Now, I was saying, here's what's interesting. The way the Gemara seems to set this up over here is the only reason also why he's paying kefal is why, because he went ahead and he took a false oath. Right? That ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, he went ahead and he swore that the object was stolen. Then it turns out that he really stole it. That's when he pays kefal. However, aval shalo b'shvua eino mishalim tishlumei kefal. Now, I will say what it sounds like over here is like this. What if you were to have a stam case, right? I go over to Ruvain and say, Ruvain, I deposited my watch with you. Can I please have it back? And Ruvain says, I'm so sorry it was stolen. Let's say no shvua occurred. Witnesses show up, they say, Ruvain, you stole it, you have it. So we'll say, in that case, it sounds like Ruvain would not pay kefel. He would pay keren. In other words, the reason why kefel is coming on the scene over here is why, we'll say, in other words, what creates the kefel obligation is the shvua. It's the shvua. So it's dafka with because of the false shvua, that's why halacha l'maisa, you have to pay kefel. Okay, to which the Gemara says, why is that? In other words, we'll say, so again, so let's look what's happening over here. Remember, we have two cases. Classic Geneva. What's classic Geneva? Right? Ruvain comes over, right? Comes into my home when I'm not there, and takes my watch. We'll just keep the same. Right? Takes my watch. That's Geneva. He's found to be the thief. He has to go ahead and pay kefel. Now we'll say the second case is Toin Tainas Ganav. So remember again, the object came into Ruvain's rishus permissibly. Why? I deposited it with him. Now what's the Gemara suggests? I come to Ruvain. Ruvain, give me back my object. Ruvain says, I'm so sorry, the object was stolen. The object was stolen. So now, halacha l'maisa, the object was stolen. So now, the way the Bryce introduced it was, and now Ruvain swears that the object was stolen, then witnesses come along and say, no, you have it. So now, what's the halacha? Ruvain is a ganav, he has to go ahead and pay kefel. The Gemara understands it's only because in Toin Tainas Ganav, it's only when you take a shvua that generates an obligation for kefel. But if there was no shavua, even if witnesses come along, he'd pay keren, but not kefel. The Gemara says, okay, how do you know that? How do you know that it's dafka shavua that goes ahead and generates tainas, that generates a chiv of kefel in toin tainas ganav? Where does that come from? Here we go. The Ten Rabbanon, Imi Matzi Aganov. So we'll say the pasuk over here is talking about as follows. So remember again, the pasuk says, Ki yitain ish al re'ehu kesef al kelim lishmar. If a person will give to his fellow, right, money or utensils to watch, or he deposited an item, the gunav mi beis ha'ish, and then the object is stolen from the home of that individual, from the shomer. Im yimatze haganav yishalim shnayim. If the thief is found, the thief has to pay kefal, has to pay double. So the Gemara says, Imi matzi haganav, if the thief will be found, we'll say, what does that refer to? Betoin tainas ganav akasam medaber. This is talking about the shomer who goes in and claims that the object was stolen from him. So the Gemara says, "B'koyin tanas ganav kasam medaber." Atomer toin tanas ganav. O eino ela beganav atzma. How do you know? How do you know it's toin tanas ganav? Maybe he's talking about a person who just stole himself. Kishu omer imlo yimatze haganov b'toin tanas ganav kasam medaber. Because I say, remember again, the pasuk says imlo yimatze haganov. There's another pasuk about that talks about actual theft, right? Straight out theft, the ganav himself. The fact that second pasuk talks about a ganav indicates that our pasuk is talking about toin tainas ganov, where you have a shomer, and the shomer is claiming that the object was stolen from him. So Tanya Idach, another brisa, Emi matze haganov, if ultimately the thief is found, begonev atzma kosov medaber. The Torah over there is talking about a case of the ganav himself. Okay, so the Gemara says, good. Aton beganav atzmo. You say the pasuk talking about the ganav himself. Oh, in elabetoni tanas ganov. Maybe it's talking about someone who claims that the object was stolen. Ayi shomer. To which the Gemara says, Kishu omer imlo yimatzi haganov. When the pasuk says, if the ganav will not be found, haritoin tanas ganov. That's talking about again a person who claims that the object was stolen from a shomer. So the Gemara says, Amar hamani mekayim imi matzi haganov. So then what do I do with the phrase imi matzi haganov? Beganav atzma kasam medaber. That's talking about ultimately the ganav himself. So I will say, what you see over here is you have two psukim. So what the Gemara is doing over here is using one of them ultimately again to be a reference to Ganav himself, person who straight out steals, and the second pasuk to be a reference to Toin Tainas Ganav. That's someone with whom the object is deposited, and he claims that the object was stolen from him. The Kuli Alma, because everyone will agree, the Kuli Alma Mias, Imlo Yimatze Aganav, Toin Tainas Ganav, Ksiv. I will say everyone agrees that the phrase Imlo Yimatze Aganav is talking about, again, the person, the Shomer, who makes the claim that the object was stolen from him. So the Gemara says, "My mashma." How do you know that? In other words, we'll say, how do you know which phrase to ascribe to what? So how do you know that the phrase "Imlo yimatze haganov" refers to toin tainas ganov and not the ganav himself? To which the Gemara says, "Amar Rav, I'll tell you why. Im lo yimatze." The phrase "Im lo yimatze kimash sha'amar elashu atzmo ganvo yishalim shnayim." Because I will say again, Rav just says straight out. Ultimately, again, in lo yimatze kimash sha'amar ela. Rather, it's referring to elashu ganav atzmo. So that phrase just lends itself to be talking about the person who steals himself, and it's not steals himself, who steals, the person who straight out himself steals. Yishalim shnayim. So therefore, I will say, so now, based on those two psukim, remember, we're trying to ascertain two things. So based on the fact that I have two similar phrases, that teaches me that the chiyuv of kefal, one of those psukim tells me that the chiyuv of kefal applies to a person who straight out steals, the ganov, and then the second pasuk teaches me that the chiyuv of kefal applies to toin tainas ganov, the person with whom the object was deposited, and then halacha l'maisa, when the owner comes to get it back, he claims, I don't have it, and then it turns out that he did steal it, he's chayiv for kefal. Now we come to the next question. So I'll say, how do I know that by toin tainas ganov, right, toin tainas ganov, you're only chayiv for kefal if you first swore that you did not have the object? So the Gemara said, this sign v'nikra balabais el elokim. So the pasuk says, the balabayis ultimately again will approach before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ultimately, so what do I do with that? So what does that refer to? L'shvua. We both say, what does it mean coming close to God or coming close to Elokim? In this case, Elokim actually means the judges, right? How do I know what is that referring to? Shvua. Ata omer l'shvua o eno elo ladin. You say it means a shvua, but maybe it just means for adjudication. Nemar shlichus yad lamata v'nemar shlichus yad lamala. We'll say it talks about stretching forth your hand. Misappropriation of an object before and afterwards. Ma lahalon l'shvua, af kan l'shvua. Just like earlier on it talks about by shvua, so too over here it's referring to shvua as well. So therefore, I will say the phrase of im lo shalach yada b'meleches re'ehu ultimately again refers to shvua itself. Sa'alach l'maisa, that teaches you that by toin tainas ganov, it only applies ultimately after shvua. So we'll have to stop over. We're leaving off at this bishlama. So I will say, bottom line, here's what we end off with. Based on the drasha psukim, what we have over here is that the din of kefal will apply ultimately again by a ganav himself, and by toin tainas ganov. What's unique about toin tainas ganov is the only time that the obligation for kefil is triggered is when ultimately again the shomer lied, right? He took a shvua and he said, I swear I did not steal the object. Then it turns out that what? He did steal the object. That's when the kefil obligation is triggered. Again, we have the first part of that drasha, the rest of the drasha Mir Hashem to be continued tomorrow, Bosai. Shkoyach.
What's the difference in a cloud and a reap?